Okay, full disclosure, I am biased because I am a member of a church that meets in a building. But are church buildings scriptural? A better question would be, are church buildings anti-scriptural? Just because something is not mentioned or named specifically in the Bible doesn't make it wrong. But we all know that house churches are mentioned several times in Scripture. I'll put the verses on the screen. The term church building is never mentioned, but there are several verses that imply that some churches were meeting in places other than houses. 1 Corinthians 11:22. What? Have ye not houses to eat and to drink in? Or despise ye the church of God, and shame them that have not? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I praise you not. Now think for a minute. If the Corinthian church was meeting in the house of one of its members, Paul would have said, have ye not your own houses to eat and to drink in? First Corinthians 14:23. If therefore the whole church be come together into one place, and all speak with tongues, and there come in those that are unlearned or unbelievers, will they not say that ye are mad? Paul took it for granted that the church could meet in a place where lost people could just wander in. A publicly accessible place. Now, where could that be? That could be in a building, just a generic-looking building that people might confuse with an office or a store or whatever. That could be in a pavilion. That could be in a big open tent, like the kind people use in those tent revivals. Or how about a synagogue? If enough Jews get saved in one city, they might just keep meeting in their synagogue, and eventually the few unbelieving Jews that are still there will leave because they don't want to be around the Christians. That almost happened in Acts 17 and 18. If therefore the whole church be come together into one place, and all speak with tongues, and there come in those that are unlearned or unbelievers, will they not say that ye are mad? Now, if I had a church meeting in my house, I would not just leave the door open for any stranger to wander into my house. I'd keep the door locked and screen people as they came in. And apparently the early Christians did the same thing. Look at Acts 12. After God got Peter out of prison, it says, starting in verse 12, and when he had considered the thing, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. And as Peter knocked at the door of the gate, a damsel came to hearken, named Rhoda. And when she knew Peter's voice, she opened not the gate for gladness, but ran in and told how Peter stood before the gate. And they said unto her, Thou art mad. But she constantly affirmed that it was even so. Then said they, It is his angel. But Peter continued knocking, and when they had opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. Okay, another verse in 1 Corinthians 14, verses 34 through 35. Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. And if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for women to speak in the church. Now, if the Corinthian church was meeting in the home of any of the married couples of the church, then Paul would have had to say, let them ask their husbands in their own home. Or let them ask their husbands after the church has left. Or let them ask their husbands without the church. Or let them ask their husbands while alone with them. He didn't say that. He said, let them ask their husbands at home. So to summarize, we can deduce from 1 Corinthians 11:22, 14:23, and 14:35 that churches do not have to be in houses. And there is no command in Scripture to prove otherwise. The fact that most churches who have church buildings today are bad churches is irrelevant to the question of whether or not it is inherently wrong to have a church building. Now, getting in debt by buying a big, fancy, expensive church building that you don't need, that is wrong. Wasting money is a sin. But all the other problems associated with church buildings, like calling the church building the church, and people confusing the church building with the Old Testament temple, none of that stuff is the fault of the building itself. That's the fault of the preacher not doing his job and explaining those things. That can be fixed. Churches and pastors should be judged individually. You can't just have a blanket condemnation of all churches in church buildings and say they are all corrupt. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if 99% of them are corrupt. I can only speak for my own church. It's not corrupt. My pastor is the most humble pastor I've ever met. He's not too proud to be corrected with Scripture. But there are also different levels of corruption. There are churches where the pastor is lost, and he's a wolf in sheep's clothing. And there are churches where the pastor is saved, but he's just too stubborn or proud or scared to go against tradition. I think many times a person who just got saved is better off in a church like that than they would be if they didn't join any church at all. Because, they can get much more screwed up if they try to learn the Bible from random people on the internet. But there are two extremes. There's the church building only philosophy, and there's the house church only philosophy. Both sides are wrong. Both sides have a holier than thou attitude. Both sides are too quick to judge people on the other side. One says, you're not a real church if you don't have a building, and the other says, you're not a real church if you don't meet in a house. It's stupid. I'd love to have a house church. If I was going to start a church, I'd start it in this tiny little apartment here, or the house of one of my first members. My pastor, he said one time, he said if he had to do it all over again, he would seriously consider starting a church in his house. And he wouldn't even bother looking for a building. So, just don't feel intimidated or pressured by the church building people or the house church people into thinking that you have to elevate one over the other. Okay? Join the best church you can. Sometimes that's a house church, sometimes it's a church with a building. And if you start a church, don't worry about tradition, just use common sense and do whatever is practical.